Oh my, would you look at that? You guys are going to love this one. It's time for episode 13.0 of Rob and Steve's Traditional Knives Anthology, and our star this evening is pretty special. Stick around, we will look at it, and I'll tell you about it. Hi gang, Rob here. It's the evening of 26 February 2015, and yes, this is episode 13.0 of our Traditional Knives Anthology. That is the TheApostleP channel in conjunction with Howabouthetruth. Thank you, Steve, for furnishing this beauty. Before I start to read Steve's world-famous copy, let's take a look around it, shall we? Oh, yes. This isn't any 2014 production of Queen or Great Eastern Cutlery, is it? No siree. Instead, this might be the kind of a knife that our friends at GEC try to emulate. And oh my goodness. Just drink it in. Think about the history of this knife. It's been around and had a long life. So here we go. I'm going to zoom in. Give you guys a little sampling of, that might be a little too tight. Let's see, let's back her up a little. Give you a little narrative from our friend Steve. Here we go. Hey Rob, and hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in. To start off the new year of 2015, and sorry I'm so delinquent, says Rob. I've been a little busy, and we're almost 2 months into 2015. So I thought, says Steve, I would do something a little different for the first video of the year by taking a step back in time, way back. Today we're looking at a rather simple but elegant two-bladed jackknife that was sold by Hibbard, Spencer, Bartlett and Company, one of the oldest, biggest, and longest-running hardware dealers in American history. During the rest of the video, we will shorten the name to the Hibbard or HSB. So I won't have to write the long name, and Rob won't have to pronounce the long name a dozen or more times. Folks, get a load of this old beauty. According to the HSB catalogs from many decades ago, this particular knife was available from the year 1900 through the year 1919, a 20-year stretch where this shield was no longer available. From 1920 forward. I'm going to back this up to normal size so you guys can get a good look at the shield. Isn't it beautiful? And look at that inscription. So that would make this knife anywhere from 96 to 115 years old. She's the oldest knife in my collection so far. Get a load of that shield. To date, this is the only one I've ever seen. Because it has had a fair share of use, but been properly cared for, it is a fine example for such an old knife. A great survivor and extremely rare. This old girl is known in the industry as an honest knife, meaning any antique knife that has been used yet never repaired, refurbished, or professionally cleaned. Experienced collectors always stress, learn how to read the knife and rely on the tang stamps as little as possible when trying to determine original condition and authenticity. Every part of this knife looks period correct. The overall patina looks consistent, and we can tell that these rare bone handles with jigging known as pick bone are indeed original due to the tiny hand-hammered rivets and pins. Pick bone handles as old as these are very hard to come by without cracks or chips and chunks missing, nor are they too pocket worn. Note how round the entire frame is. Let's kind of look at the profile of the knife. And Steve's right, isn't he? There's quite a radius over the entire surface of the bone handles. There are 4 pins counting the pivot on the back handle, with only 3 on the front cover. So 1, 2, 3, 4, count the pivot. I'm sorry. He doesn't mean the pivot for the blade, he means the pivot for the back springs. This is due to the large golden rule shield being pinned at each end. The knife is a standard 3.5 inches closed. It is very close to the same size and shape of the GEC Charlos. Even the blade stock is the same thickness, yet this old girl seems rather petite. Of course, I think the Charlos are a little petite. This petite appearance for a standard size folder is due mainly to the smaller bolsters at each end, especially the butt cap. And even the front bolster is pretty narrow front to back. But if you look even more closely, you'll notice that the bottom edge face of all 4, where they mate to the bone handles across the entire cover, you will see the bolsters are slightly elliptical. Okay, much like the shape of a thumbnail, a very classy build. You won't see knives made like this anymore, and they haven't been since about 1930 or so. This knife was obviously retired from use by one of its owners along the way, as evidenced by both blades that barely have any wear. Let's take a look at that. You can see a pretty generous amount of the sharpening notch on this main blade still present. And you see really no recurve in this area. Which kind of bears out what Steve's talking about. Now let's look at the pen blade now. Typically pen blades are not sharpened as much as main blades, but again, a good portion of the sharpening notch still left and nothing but belly from back to front. And as a side note, the knife was not over sharpened, but it's still pretty sharp. Both blades are. I finally found an illustration of this knife, says Steve, in an old catalog in which the drawing is precise for all related dimensions. To get an idea of how much blade wear this knife has, look at the thin long pole of the master spear blade. The very thin width of this long pole nail neck is about as much steel as missing from either blade. I would probably agree with that. In fact, I'm not sure there's that much. So that long pole is probably about 40 thousandths wide, and I don't think there's that much blade steel missing from either blade. The thinness behind the edge kind of bears that out. I don't think this main blade is more than 15 thousandths thick behind the edge in any location on the knife. I bet you there's not 20 thousandths of blade breadth missing from this. So not much missing at all, guys, says Steve. There is no rust anywhere and only one small pitted area on only one side of each blade. I don't know that I can even find that. Oh, yep. Right through here on the main blade, and I'm not sure I'm really finding any. Yeah, there might be a little pitting up here on the pen. There are no rust inside the springs. Anything you see that's dark is just dried oil. Hang on, I'm going to pull out a light so we can actually look in this blade well. Pretty doggone clean, isn't it? Indeed. Guys, my hands are like shaking because this knife is so cool. Oh my. Both springs have terrific action. The half stop snap, especially the pen blade. And I'm being very careful as I close these blades, not letting them snap from the half stop, because as Steve said, this pick bone jigging pattern generally produces cracks, and we don't want to slam these blades home and have any cracks. Even though the cut swedges on either side of the main blade are the same, and due to that long pull running into the swedge, let's inspect the back swedge. Okay. Note how it begins with a graceful curve instead of being cut straight. Very cool. That took a steady, experienced hand and done with great care. Now imagine repeating that shape tens of thousands of times, if not more. I tip my hat to the fine artisans of that bygone era. Both blades really are of the same stock thickness. Okay. As a two-bladed Charlo would be. I checked them side by side, but it doesn't seem like it. Now look at how they ground the entire back side of the pen blade, and that is pretty cool. Notice that funky Z shape where the tang transitions into the base of the blade. See it? Plus the angle of the notch for that swedge. Look at that up close. See it? See how it's not ground perpendicular? Very cool. More on this in a minute, as you will see. Of all fine collectible knives that were carried and sold by Hibbard, they rank right up there with the best in appraised values. The reason is that this giant old hardware dealer never made their own knives, but they only contracted with the best manufacturers. HSB Company contracted with at least 6 of the very best cutlery companies that I know of, and there were several more as well. This is exactly why many, if not most, of the older HSB knives are so highly prized and sought after. Among the list of makers were New York Knife Company, Robeson, the older Schrade Cutlery Company, Ulster, Utica, and Camillus are the 6 I know of so far. But HSB never allowed these companies to mark the tang stamps in that maker's name. Only Hibbard, Spencer, Bartlett and Company was used. You will see that on this knife. For example, on the main blade tang, that should say Hibbard or HSB and Company. Let's see. Hibbard, Spencer, Bartlett, and Company. And then the pen blade stamp says, okay, HSB and Company. In an arch over a diamond shape with Chicago underneath in an underslung arch. It's quite a task for even the experts to guess at who actually made any particular knife. But oftentimes each company's unique styling and various components will give it away. By the way, the reason for Chicago on the blade tang of that pen is that HSB was embossed in these knives in Chicago, I guess regardless of the maker. So Hibbard also adopted the trademarked logo of Our Very Best, or OVB for short, to be etched on some of their models, and also an OVB stamp would be used on a bolster. Some collectors like these knives even more, the OVB knives, but due to the fact several of the makers would dress the Hibbard knives with this OVB etch or stamping, it can be found on many of their cheapest, simplest models, all the way up to their priciest pearl-handled Whittlers. Many of their best knives did not have OVB, and either with or without spanned many years. Many folks believe an OVB marked knife is made to a higher quality standard. This is false. The OVB marked knives are simply more popular to some collectors. Take my word for it, folks. The model and condition and rarity and time era are what will dictate the value over anything else. So who made my sweet little old golden rule knife? After weeks of frustrating searches online, I finally found out. Bear in mind, we only knew when this knife was made, from the 1900 to 1919 catalogs, but it never said who. In an old Schrade catalog from the same era, there it was. Only it didn't have the fancy golden rule shield. It was only an illustration, no actual photo. Remember the funky Z-shaped grind on the back of the pen blade? Let's look at that again. The photograph knife had the same identical blade, both blades and frame actually. Either Schrade or Ulster, they were partners, made this knife. A quick, condensed version of the HSB and Company history. In 1853, William Gold Hibbard was a top salesman for Brown Tuttle Hardware Company out of Chicago. In 1855, Hibbard partnered with Tuttle to be called Tuttle Hibbard Company. In 1864, Adolphus Clay Bartlett began working as a janitor. Spencer partnered with Hibbard 1 year later as Hibbard Spencer and Company. Tuttle was out. 2 different fires, including the Great Chicago Fire, destroyed their main building. Twice. In 1882, Bartlett, who began as a janitor, became secretary, and the classic 3-man company name was born. By 1930, even though all 3 men had passed away earlier, the company celebrated their 75th anniversary. 2 years later, in 1932, they announced a new brand of product and tool line called True Value. The company was still HSB and Company. Finally, in 1962, the entire company and all interests were sold for $2.5 million to a new group who in turn renamed the entire company True Value Hardware Stores that we all know about today. The older OVB trademark, back when it was used, also graced many other Hibbard products, not just knives. When I admire this old knife I now own, it makes me wonder about several things. And I feel honored to be the present steward or curator of this little time machine. For Folks, you have to understand, when this knife was new, all the way up to 20 years old or older, depending on the year it was made, the vast majority of Americans still got around with a horse and buggy. Here are two statistical facts. In 1900, there were only 4,192 automobiles sold in the entire country. By the year 1920, 326,000 cars were sold nationwide. That's less than 700 cars per state. I also wonder how many folks this knife has probably been owned by who have passed away, and how life in America was totally different back then, even compared to my 53 years of existence. This little old knife has most certainly seen some vastly different times, lives, even situations and settings. And then there are the people who held it or used it. Who, where, how did they live? This knife was no safe queen in the beginning, so it had to have gotten around. If only this little knife could talk. Thank you, Steve. But I say, this little knife does talk. It talks because Steve writes about it. Don't you guys just love the passion and love that he puts into his research for these little videos? I sure do. Isn't that thing a beauty? Man, just amazingly well constructed. It's 100 years old, and it's still all here. Wow. That's all for tonight, my friends. Thank you, Steve, for trusting me for a few weeks with this little beauty. I'll make sure it gets home safely. That's all for episode 13, guys. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And remember, the word is sharp.